Daniel Carter never expected his life to change on an ordinary evening at the Intergalactic Academy. He was just a human student, one of the few allowed to study among various alien species. His focus was on xenoanthropology, learning about different cultures. He never thought he'd be involved in an intergalactic political crisis. The night was quiet, and Daniel walked through the Academy's garden. Tall, glowing trees swayed gently, casting soft blue light across the stone pathways. He liked coming here. It was peaceful, a place to clear his mind from difficult studies. But tonight, something felt different. A rustling sound came from behind the bushes. At first, Daniel thought it was just a small creature. But then, a figure stumbled out, breathing heavily. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen before. Her silver hair shimmered under the garden's soft light, her golden eyes wide with fear. Strange glowing markings ran along her arms, and she wore an elegant torn cloak that suggested nobility. She tried to run, but her legs gave out. Daniel rushed forward, catching her just in time. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, surprised by how cold her skin felt. The girl flinched at his touch, her eyes darting around in panic. "No, they're coming," she whispered. Before Daniel could ask who, a loud mechanical voice echoed through the garden. "Princess Sylar. Surrender immediately, Eloy." Daniel turned sharply. Several figures in dark armor marched into the garden, their weapons glowing. Bounty hunters. They moved with precision, scanning the area. Their leader, a tall alien with a reptilian face, growled, "She's here. Find her." Daniel's heart pounded. Princess. He looked at the terrified girl in his arms. He didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear. She was in danger. The bounty hunters spread out. They would find her in seconds. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed Silvera's hand and pulled her toward the bushes. She gasped but followed, her breath shaky. They crouched behind the thick foliage, barely hidden as the hunters passed. "Where did she go?" One of them hissed. "She was injured. She can't be far," another growled. Daniel held his breath. One wrong move, and they were dead. Silvera clutched his arm tightly, her body trembling. She whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Daniel didn't know the answer himself. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the way she looked so desperate, so afraid. "Because you need help," he whispered back. For a moment, their eyes met, hers filled with fear and uncertainty, his filled with determination. The bounty hunters moved on, but they wouldn't be gone for long. Daniel knew one thing. He had just stepped into something much bigger than himself, and there was no turning back. Daniel's heart pounded as he crouched in the bushes with Princess Silvera, trying to stay hidden. The bounty hunters were still searching, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel paths of the Intergalactic Academy's garden. Their voices were cold, calculating. "She must be here," one of them growled. "We saw her enter this area." Daniel's mind raced. He was just a student, a normal human. What was he doing helping a fugitive princess? But when he glanced at Silvera, he knew he couldn't just leave her. The glow of a scanner swept dangerously close. Silvera held her breath, gripping Daniel's wrist so tightly that her nails dug into his skin. For a second, Daniel thought they were caught. Then, a distant alarm blared. One of the hunters cursed. "Another intrusion. We need to move." "Find the princess first," the leader ordered. Daniel saw his chance. He leaned close to Silvera and whispered, "We need to move. Now." She nodded, her golden eyes filled with trust, running for their lives. Daniel pulled her up, and together they slipped through the bushes, moving away from the patrol. The academy had many paths, but Daniel knew a shortcut, a narrow service tunnel behind the greenhouse. He had used it before to sneak into the library late at night. "Where are we going?" Silvera asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Somewhere safe," Daniel replied, leading her through the shadows. They reached the hidden tunnel. Daniel quickly unlocked the panel using his student ID and pulled Silvera inside. The door sealed behind them, cutting off the sounds of the hunters. For a moment, they both stood in silence, catching their breath. "You're a student here?" Silvera finally asked, looking at him with curiosity. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead. "Yeah, just a regular human student." "And you're a princess." Silvera hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. And now, because you helped me, you're in danger too." "A dangerous secret." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "Great. Just what I needed. Who's after you?" Silvera looked down. "Bounty hunters sent by enemies of my family. If they catch me, I won't survive." Daniel swallowed hard. This wasn't some academy prank. This was real. And now he was involved. He sighed. "All right. We need to get you off campus. Do you have a plan?" Silvera blinked in surprise. "You're still helping me." Daniel shrugged. "Yeah, well, I don't like bullies." For the first time, Silvera smiled. "Just a little. Then we need to move fast. Because they won't stop hunting me." Daniel nodded. "Then let's make sure they never find you." As they disappeared into the tunnels, Daniel knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. Daniel led Princess Silvera through the dark, narrow tunnels beneath the Intergalactic Academy. The only light came from flickering emergency panels on the walls, casting eerie shadows around them. His heart was still racing from the close call with the bounty hunters. Silvera, still weak from exhaustion, stumbled slightly. Daniel caught her arm, steadying her. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, but he could see the strain on her face. "I just need a moment to rest." Daniel sighed. They didn't have much time, but he couldn't push her too hard. He helped her sit on a metal crate, glancing back toward the tunnel entrance. The bounty hunters wouldn't give up. They were still out there searching. A race against time. "We can't stay here long," Daniel said, crouching in front of her. "They're gonna figure out we escaped underground." Silvera took a deep breath, then looked at him. "Why are you helping me, Daniel? You don't even know me." Daniel hesitated. Why was he risking everything for her? He could have just stayed out of it, gone back to his normal student life. But something about her, her fear, her desperation, her loneliness, made him want to help. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I couldn't just leave you there." Silvera's golden eyes softened. "Thank you." A sudden alarm blared through the tunnels, making them both jump. "Inturudeoras dthct. Lockdown engaged." Daniel's stomach dropped. The Academy's security system had found them. A desperate decision. "We need to move. Now." Daniel grabbed Silvera's hand and pulled her to her feet. They ran deeper into the tunnels as metal doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off escape routes. Silvera's breathing was ragged, but she kept going. "Where does this lead?" "There's an exit near the industrial sector," Daniel said. "I used it before." He stopped mid-sentence as they turned a corner and nearly crashed into a squad of armed guards. Daniel's heart froze. "Step away from the girl," the guard commander ordered, his weapon aimed directly at Daniel. "She is wanted by the Galactic Senate." Daniel slowly raised his hands, his mind racing. This wasn't just bounty hunters. This was bigger than he thought. Silvera stepped in front of him. "Please, let him go. He has nothing to do with this." The commander's eyes narrowed. "He aided your escape. That makes him a traitor." Daniel clenched his fists. He wasn't about to let them take her. Thinking fast, he spotted an exposed power conduit behind the guards. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a shock tool, and hurled it at the panel. Sparks exploded. The lights flickered. The guards were momentarily blinded. "Run," Daniel shouted. He grabbed Silvera's hand and bolted down the tunnel, guards yelling behind them. As they ran toward their last chance at escape, Daniel realized this was no longer just about helping her. It was about survival. The sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow tunnels as Daniel and Silvera ran, their hearts racing. Behind them, the security alarms blared, and the faint voices of guards calling out for reinforcements reached their ears. They had only one chance to escape, and every second felt like a lifetime. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," Daniel panted, glancing over his shoulder. Silvera's eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't falter. "We can make it, just a little further." They reached the end of the tunnel, a rusted door that led to the industrial sector, where old machines and vehicles were stored. The place was a maze of metal walkways and old cargo crates, perfect for hiding. Daniel slammed his hand against the door's security panel, and with a satisfying clunk, the door creaked open. They darted inside, but the place was far from safe. The metal structures and heavy equipment were useful for hiding, but they also limited their movement. "We can't stay here long," Daniel said, scanning the area for any sign of danger. Silvera nodded, her expression serious. "You're right. We need to get off this planet. Fast." But as they huddled in the shadows, catching their breath, something about Silvera's tone changed. Her usual fear was replaced with a strange, intense calm. "Daniel," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." He turned to her, concerned. "What is it?" Silvera took a deep breath, her golden eyes locking with his. "I didn't just get you involved because you helped me escape. There's an ancient Carithian tradition, a bond that is formed when someone saves another's life. It's a debt that can never be repaid. But in my case, it's different." Daniel blinked, unsure of what she was saying. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you're now bound to me. You're my mate." Daniel stared at her, shocked. "Mate? What are you talking about? I didn't do this to..." Silvera interrupted, her face serious. "In my culture, saving someone's life creates a bond, a life debt. I have now pledged myself to you. You, too, are now a part of my family." Daniel took a step back, his mind spinning. This was insane. He was a human student. No one in the universe had ever heard of a human becoming an alien's mate. "So, what?" he stammered. "You're saying I'm stuck with you?" Silvera nodded slowly. "Yes. For the rest of your life, I cannot undo this bond. You are now part of my family, and my people will honor it." Daniel's mind raced. The stakes were suddenly much higher than just escaping bounty hunters. He wasn't just running for his life anymore. He was now tied to an alien princess, a family he didn't understand, with an entire empire watching his every move. "You don't have to be afraid," Silvera continued, her voice softening. "I will protect you. But this is your choice now. We face this together." Daniel didn't know what to think, but he felt something stirring inside him. A deep sense of responsibility. Somehow, despite the chaos, he couldn't walk away. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady. "We face this together." As the distant sounds of footsteps echoed closer, Daniel realized that this was just the beginning. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The security alarms were still blaring, echoing off the walls of the industrial sector. They were too close, too many guards, too many eyes searching for them. Silvera's hand tightened around his wrist. Her once calm demeanor was now filled with tension. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Daniel could feel the reality of their situation sinking in. "We don't have much time," she whispered urgently, her eyes scanning the shadows. Daniel nodded, already moving toward a row of stacked crates. They had to hide, but there was nowhere near enough cover. The open space around them made it impossible to remain undetected for long. "We can't stay here," he said, pulling her behind a large metal container. "I've got a plan, but it's risky." Silvera met his gaze. "I trust you." That was all Daniel needed. They didn't have time for second-guessing. Adrenaline was coursing through his veins, and he could feel every moment pulling them closer to danger. He glanced around quickly, searching for anything that could help. His eyes landed on an old, battered cargo ship parked nearby. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but if it was still functional, it could be their escape. "That's our ticket out of here," Daniel said, pointing toward the ship. Silvera followed his gaze. "It looks old." "Doesn't matter," Daniel replied. "If we can get inside and fire up the engines, we're out of here." They crouched low, moving carefully toward the ship. As they got closer, Daniel's ears caught the faint sound of voices. The guards were getting nearer. "Where are they?" One of the guards called out, his voice booming through the silence. Daniel froze. They had to make it to the ship. It was their only chance. "We need to move, now," he said under his breath. He sprinted forward, pulling Silvera with him. The ship was closer now, its rusty exterior covered in a layer of dirt and grime. It was a relic from another time, but it had enough power to get them out of this nightmare. They reached the entrance, and Daniel quickly slipped inside, Silvera following close behind. The control panel was covered in dust, but it looked like it was still operational. Daniel didn't waste any time. He slammed his hand on the console, and after a moment of grinding and creaking, the ship's engines came to life with a low rumble. But just as the engines roared, a harsh voice echoed outside the ship. "There they are." Daniel's blood ran cold. They had been spotted. "Go, go, go," he shouted, pushing Silvera into the pilot's seat. He quickly scrambled into the co-pilot's chair, his hands flying over the controls. The ship jerked forward, and the familiar hum of engines filled the air. They were lifting off, but the guards were already firing at them, their shots hitting the hull with a loud bang. "Hold on," Daniel yelled. He pulled back on the controls, sending the ship soaring into the sky. As they broke free from the atmosphere, Daniel couldn't help but glance at Silvera. The look in her eyes was a mix of relief and fear. They had made it out, but the hard part was far from over. "Where do we go now?" Daniel asked, his voice steady despite the danger. Silvera looked at him, her golden eyes filled with resolve. "We need to get to my homeworld. Only then will we be safe." Daniel nodded. They were heading into enemy territory, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The ship sped through the dark expanse of space, its engines whining under the strain of their sudden departure. Outside, the vast emptiness of the galaxy stretched endlessly, a cold reminder of just how far Daniel and Silvera were from everything they had ever known. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound as the two of them sat in tense silence. Daniel kept his eyes on the control panel, his hands gripping the controls tightly. They had narrowly escaped, but the bounty hunters were no doubt still chasing them. Silvera was right. Their journey was far from over. They had to get to her homeworld, but that was easier said than done. "How much longer?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking the silence. He wasn't sure if he was asking about the journey or the constant threat that lingered over them. Silvera glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "We're still a few days out, but that's not the problem." "What do you mean?" Daniel looked at her, confusion clouding his face. Silvera's gaze turned serious. "The real danger lies ahead. My homeworld is in turmoil, and even though I'm the princess, there are forces there who want me dead. The Senate will never allow me to return, not after what happened." Daniel didn't know what to say. His mind was still reeling from the events that had unfolded so quickly. Just days ago, he was a student, buried in books about alien cultures and history. Now he was on the run with an alien princess, with an entire galaxy hunting them. "You said you trust me," he said quietly, meeting her gaze. "Then what do we do?" Silvera's eyes softened. "You don't understand yet, Daniel. The bond between us, the one that makes you my mate, it means you're not just helping me anymore. You're part of my family. And my people are powerful, but they follow ancient customs, and that might be the very thing that saves us." Daniel blinked. "What do you mean by ancient customs?" Silvera took a deep breath, her voice calm but filled with a hint of worry. My people are bound by a deep tradition. There is a weapon, a ship, a royal artifact, that can only be wielded by the chosen one, someone who has a bond like ours. But it hasn't been used for centuries, and it's locked in a fortress that's impossible to enter. Daniel's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. And you think I can help unlock it? Silvera nodded slowly. Yes, you are the key, Daniel. Your bond to me will make it possible for you to enter the fortress, to activate the ship. But no one, not even my own people, believe it's possible for a human to control it. Daniel swallowed hard, staring at the control panel. The ship was still flying on autopilot, but the weight of Silvera's words felt heavier than anything he had experienced so far. You're saying I have to prove them wrong? Daniel asked, his voice uncertain but growing stronger. I have to do the impossible. Silvera's golden eyes gleamed with an intensity that Daniel had never seen before. Exactly. Only you can wield it. Only you can save us. Daniel glanced out the ship's window, the stars flickering in the distance. The odds seemed impossible, but somehow, with Silvera by his side, he felt a flicker of hope. He had come this far. Why not take the next step? Then let's prove them wrong, he said, his voice full of determination. Silvera smiled, a look of relief crossing her face. Together. And so, with the stars as their only guide, they headed toward the fortress and the future that awaited them both. The ship continued its journey through the vastness of space, the stars streaking by in silent brilliance. The hum of the engines was a constant, but it did little to calm the tension that hung thick in the air. Daniel sat at the co-pilot's seat, eyes glued to the navigation panel, while Silvera sat beside him, her golden eyes distant and troubled. They were heading toward her homeworld, Kareth, a planet rich with history and power. But as they got closer, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Silvera had warned him about what awaited them. Her father, the Emperor, was not a man to be crossed, and the Carithian Senate was a force to be reckoned with. Silvera was the rightful heir, but she had been exiled, and her return was considered a threat. There was a chance that the Senate would reject her and demand her life as punishment for escaping. Daniel, a human, was now caught in the middle of a political firestorm. Are you sure about this? Daniel asked, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. I mean, I don't know if I'm ready to face your father and his people. Silvera turned to him, her expression calm but filled with an inner strength. There is no turning back now. You're with me. They can't take you away from me. Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. They had come this far together, and no matter what, he wouldn't let her face this alone. As they entered Kareth's orbit, the ship was immediately scanned by the planet's defense system. The hum of the ship's systems shifting indicated they were being granted access, though the process was anything but smooth. The voice of a robotic AI filled the cabin. Identification required. Princess Silvera of the Carithian Empire. Silvera's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. There was a long pause, and then the AI responded. Access granted. The ship descended toward the royal capital, a sprawling city of towering structures, shimmering lakes, and grand palaces. The beauty of the city took Daniel's breath away, but he knew this wasn't just a sightseeing trip. As the ship landed, a group of royal guards was already waiting for them. They moved with military precision, their eyes trained on Silvera. They recognized her instantly, but they didn't greet her with the warmth she had hoped for. Instead, their faces were stone cold, their weapons ready. Princess Silvera, the leader of the guards, said, his tone stiff, "The Emperor requests your presence. Immediately." Silvera nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping down from the ship. Daniel followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the guards and the surrounding area. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The royal palace was a towering structure, an imposing symbol of the Carithian Empire's strength and history. The Emperor, Silvera's father waited for them in the throne room. He was a tall, regal figure with dark, piercing eyes. His presence filled the room with authority. Silvera. His voice was low and powerful. You returned to my home after betraying me. Silvera stood tall, meeting her father's gaze without flinching. I didn't betray you, father. I was trying to save my life. Silence. The Emperor's voice rang out, cutting her off. His gaze shifted to Daniel. And this human, what is his purpose in all this? Silvera's eyes flashed with defiance. This human is my choice, and he is more important than you realize. The Emperor's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing in a silent challenge. Daniel could feel the weight of his stare, but he held his ground. The Emperor took a step forward, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. Then, prove it. Daniel knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but one thing was clear: he was fighting for Silvera now, and he would face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The atmosphere in the throne room was thick with tension. Daniel stood beside Silvera, his heart racing as he faced the Emperor of Kerith. The ruler's gaze was like a weight pressing down on him, but he refused to look away. He had no idea what the Emperor had in mind, but he was ready for whatever came next. Silvera stood tall, her posture unyielding. Father, I am not your enemy, she said, her voice calm but firm. I returned because I believe in the future of Kerith. I didn't come back to fight you. The Emperor's expression remained unreadable. He didn't speak for several long moments, as if weighing his options. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. You are my daughter, Silvera, but you have brought a human into my palace, one of the most insignificant beings in the galaxy. You think he can stand beside you and guide this empire. Daniel clenched his fists. It wasn't the first time he'd been dismissed because of his humanity, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But this time, it mattered more than ever. Before he could respond, the Emperor raised a hand. Enough. I will not have my throne threatened by a child's foolish decisions. Silvera flinched, but she didn't back down. Father, this is not just about power. It's about survival. She turned to Daniel. He saved me, and now he is tied to my destiny, to our destiny. The Emperor's gaze flickered between the two of them. His eyes narrowed as he finally spoke again, his voice like ice. If you truly believe this human has earned a place by your side, then he must prove it. He will fight for it. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Fight? What are you? The Emperor cut him off. You will duel one of my best warriors. If you win, I will acknowledge your place by my daughter's side. But if you lose, you will leave Kerith, never to return. Daniel's mind raced. A duel? He was no warrior. He was just a student. But Silvera's words echoed in his mind. This is about survival. I don't have a choice, do I? Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. No, the Emperor replied simply. Silvera turned to Daniel, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. Daniel, you don't have to do this. I will protect you. But Daniel shook his head. No, I promised you I'd stand by you, and I will. I won't back down. The Emperor motioned toward the side of the throne room. From the shadows, a Kerithian warrior stepped forward, a towering figure with muscles rippling under his armored suit. His eyes were fierce, his posture confident. The warrior unsheathed a long blade, its edge gleaming in the dim light. You will face Therak, my champion, the Emperor declared. The battle will be to the first blood. Win, and you may remain. Fail, and you will be discarded like all the others. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't a fighter. But this was Silvera's future, his future. He couldn't back down now. With a deep breath, Daniel stepped forward, his hands trembling as they hovered near his sides. He didn't know how he was going to win, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. As the warriors squared off, Daniel realized that this wasn't just a test of strength. It was a test of willpower, courage, and the bonds they shared. He had no idea how this would end, but he knew one thing for sure. He was fighting for Silvera. The arena was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Daniel stood facing the Carithian warrior, Theric, his heart pounding in his chest. The blade in Theric's hand glinted in the light, and the warrior's stance was firm, ready for battle. Daniel could barely hold his breath as he tried to steady his shaking hands. This wasn't just about a fight. It was his chance to prove himself, to earn his place beside Silvera. The Emperor's voice echoed through the stadium. The duel will begin now, to the first blood. Let the challenge prove who is worthy. Daniel nodded, barely able to keep his mind focused. What was he doing here? He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a warrior. He was a human, thrown into a world he barely understood. This was impossible. But as he glanced at Silvera, standing beside her father, her golden eyes filled with concern and hope, something inside him hardened. He couldn't let her down. Theric's eyes never left Daniel. He was a trained fighter, and his presence alone was intimidating. With a quick movement, the warrior lunged at Daniel, his blade slicing through the air with terrifying speed. Daniel barely managed to step back in time, the blade grazing his side and sending a flash of pain through him. The crowd gasps as Daniel stumbles, but he quickly recovers, his mind racing. His body might not be as strong or fast as Theric's, but he had something the warrior didn't, a burning desire to protect Silvera. That alone had to be enough. He moved swiftly, using his surroundings to his advantage. He wasn't trained in combat, but he was quick on his feet, and he had learned enough in his studies to understand the basic principles of defense. He dodged another swipe of the blade, this time pushing against the ground with his foot to launch himself toward Theric. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down. Daniel saw Theric's surprise as he adjusted to block the human's sudden move. Daniel's hands grabbed for anything, his fingers finding a discarded piece of armor on the ground. It wasn't much, but it would work as a shield. With renewed determination, Daniel raised his makeshift shield just in time to deflect Theric's next blow. The force of the strike pushed him back, but he held on, refusing to let go. Silvera's face flashed in his mind. He couldn't fail her. Theric growled, clearly annoyed that this fight was taking longer than he expected. With a roar, the Carithian warrior made his final attempt, swinging his blade down with all his strength. Daniel barely managed to sidestep the strike, but it was close, too close. He couldn't keep avoiding the blows forever. He had to end this, and soon. In that moment of panic, something clicked in his mind. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for everything. He gathered all his strength, and with an instinctive move, gripped Theric's wrist, twisting it so sharply that the warrior was forced to release his weapon. The blade clattered to the ground, leaving Theric defenseless. The crowd fell silent. Theric glared at Daniel, fury burning in his eyes. Daniel stood tall, breathing hard, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The Emperor's voice rang out. Enough. The human wins. Daniel lowered his arms, his legs shaking with exhaustion. He had done it. For a moment, he could barely believe it. The impossible was done. Silvera rushed forward, her face lighting up with relief. She stopped in front of Daniel, eyes filled with gratitude. Without saying a word, she reached up and touched his cheek gently. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Daniel smiled, his exhaustion forgotten for a moment. "I couldn't do it without you." And just like that, their bond was sealed, not just by a fight, but by trust, by love, by survival. The Emperor, his expression unreadable, stood from his throne. "You have proven yourself, human. You are now part of my daughter's future." Daniel nodded, knowing that this was just the beginning of an entirely new life. A life with Silvera. A life together. The day after the duel was a blur. Daniel couldn't quite process the gravity of what had just happened. He had won the fight, proved his worth, and earned his place by Silvera's side. Yet everything felt surreal. He was still just a human student, now standing in a royal palace, surrounded by Carithian customs he barely understood. But today was different. Today, the reality of what had happened started to settle in. Silvera was by his side, and together, they walked through the vast corridors of the palace. The halls were adorned with tapestries, each depicting ancient battles and the history of the Carithian Empire. The weight of the empire's past hung in the air, but Silvera's presence made him feel less out of place. Her confidence, her strength, she had a power that he had never fully understood until now. "You look like you're lost in thought," she said softly, glancing at him with a warm smile. Daniel snapped out of his daze, meeting her gaze. "I still can't believe I'm here, in your world." Silvera laughed, a light sound that filled the air. "You've earned your place here, Daniel. This is as much your world as it is mine." They reached the central chamber, where the emperor awaited them. His regal presence filled the room, his dark eyes watching them closely. The tension from the day before still lingered, but there was something else now, a quiet respect. "You have done well, human," the emperor said, his voice firm but less harsh than before. "You have earned your place by my daughter's side." Daniel nodded, unsure of what to say. He had never been one for formalities, but he knew this moment was important. The emperor's approval meant something, maybe not everything, but enough to make the journey worth it. "What happens now?" Daniel asked, finally breaking the silence. The emperor's lips curled into a slight smile. "Now you learn." He motioned to the grand table before them. "You are not just Silvera's mate now, Daniel. You are a part of this empire. You will learn our ways, our customs, and how to rule, not with force, but with wisdom." Daniel's heart raced. He wasn't sure if he was ready for all of this, but he knew one thing: he couldn't back down now. Silvera stepped forward, her hand gently resting on his arm. "You're not alone in this, Daniel. We face everything together." Her words, simple but full of meaning, grounded him. He had never asked for any of this, but somehow it felt right. Being by her side, helping her lead, not just as a human, but as someone who was becoming part of her world, part of her family. The emperor nodded in approval, then turned his attention back to Daniel. "There is much to learn, much to change, but I see the strength in you. The Carithians have always believed in their warriors, but we are beginning to see that strength comes in many forms." Daniel smiled, feeling the new sense of purpose. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about a new beginning, for him, for Silvera, and for the empire they would build together. Silvera squeezed his hand, and together they turned toward the future. There would be challenges, of course, but now they had each other, and that made all the difference. As the doors to the throne room closed behind them, Daniel finally understood what he had gained. Not just a place in this world, but a family, a future with Silvera, and he was ready for it.